Hello and welcome to Let's Talk About Money. Today I have a great episode for you. I'm going to be talking to Kim Soul, who is in Manitoba. And Kim was called to the Manitoba Bar in 2009 and has been practicing exclusively in the area of family law since that time. She received her training in collaborative family law in 2011 and has focused on that process for dispute resolution since that time, as well as receiving her mediation training in 2019. And this will all make sense once I tell you what we're talking about today. Welcome, Kim. Tell me, who do you work with and where do you practice?
Thanks for having me. I'm super excited to be here and chat. I currently work at a law firm called Bennett Waugh Court. I'm an associate there, but I actually am just in the process of starting my own law firm and to work on being a solo. So that firm will be called Soul Family Law, and I'm really excited about that.
Oh, I'm excited for you. Congratulations. That's so
Thanks.
exciting. What a timely interview. That's
Yes.
great. Wonderful. So, Kim is joining us today to speak about prenuptial agreements. This is something that comes up in my day job quite a bit. The past couple of years, we've had an increase in divorce and, of course, selling of the matrimonial home. And if there's a prenup in place, then things go a lot more smoothly. Of course, not everybody does have a prenuptial agreement. But, Kim, can you start just by telling us what is a prenuptial agreement according to Canadian law?
So, a prenuptial agreement is a document that sets out what will happen to your assets and debts, spousal support if you were to separate. Everybody has a prenuptial agreement. That's the current Canadian law across your province in Canada. It sets out what would happen if you were to separate. If you don't like what that law does, then you can enter into your own agreement to opt out of those laws and to decide what you want to happen if you were to separate.
All right, so tell us what happens if we don't have another agreement that we've put in place? What is the typical thing that will happen if we do separate?
So, if you were married, the Divorce Act applies to your relationship, and that's standard across Canada. And so, what would happen is your assets and debts would be divided between you and your former partner. We would look at those debts as of the date of separation. Anything in joint names is the current value. So, if you separate and then 5 years later decide to deal with your assets and debts, any joint assets, those values are the as of that date of separation. Those are divided equally. One party could seek spousal support from the other. So if there's a situation where one party has missed out on opportunities or has a lower income, spousal support can be a discussion, and that is the grayest, hardest area of the law. And so having an agreement that sets out what would happen in that case can really eliminate the need to have a disagreement or go to court and get a court order and a judge to decide for you.
And what changes if I'm in a common law relationship? If I'm not legally married, what's that distinction?
Great question. So in Manitoba, there is legislation called the Family Law Act and the Family Property Act that would set out what would happen with respect to your assets and debts. In Manitoba, it's very similar to if you were married. There are some timeline differences for when you can apply, but the actual process is pretty similar, and your entitlements and rights and obligations are similar. That is not the case in every province, so you would want to check with a lawyer in your jurisdiction to see, the definition for common law in your jurisdiction when you reach that timeline that you'd have to share property, or you could be susceptible to paying or receiving spousal support. But in Manitoba, it's fairly similar.
All right, so province to province may differ slightly. So Kim is licensed in Manitoba. If you want a referral to a family lawyer in Ontario, just get a hold of me. I'm happy to provide one. I have a couple of wonderful lawyers who I work with who are licensed in Ontario, so you can get that pertinent information if you need it. Now, let's rewind a little bit. Say I entered the relationship, I am legally married with assets. Or maybe I had put the down payment on the home and my partner at the time did not contribute. How does the law deal with this if there's not an agreement in place?
So if you put a down payment on a home that's jointly owned with your partner, you've then gifted your partner that down payment. So at the end of the day, when you separate, whatever the equity in the house, which includes that down payment, that would be shareable with your former partner. So if you don't want that to happen, you need to have an agreement at the time of doing that to ensure that you get that down payment back if you were to separate. If you are not putting it in joint names, it can still be non-shareable depending on where the funds came from, whether it's really clear that you took those funds from a pre-acquired asset that wasn't shareable and then placed it into the down payment. So it gets pretty murky. And so it gives the opportunity to your former partner to argue that it should be shareable. So to be really clear, it's best to have that agreement that says it's not shareable. And it depends on the
Mm.
timing of when you purchased the house as well. Were you living together when you purchased it? Did you have it before? Have you kept those monies separate when you did start living together? So there's a lot of things to look at if it's not clearly set out in an agreement.
Fair enough. So if I'm at the point where I want to purchase a home, there might be some finicky details like down payment, where it's coming from, not ready for a prenuptial agreement. Is a cohabitation agreement something that will kind of satisfy this for me?
Yes, and you don't have to do a cohabitation agreement on everything. You could just have a cohabitation agreement that says the down payment I put on the house is mine if we were to separate. So you don't have to talk about all your assets and debts or decide everything. You could, but if you want it just to be a narrow issue, that's a pretty easy process, short document. Both parties would need independent legal advice, so your own lawyer to tell you what the law would do, and that ensures the agreement is valid and binding. But you should do that, before you put it on the mortgage, before you move in, have that all ready to go, especially if it's your money saved from many years or a gift from your parents or things like that. You may want to keep that separate.
So what I'm hearing is, if we're making a large purchase together, we want a long runway for planning so that we can have all of our ducks in a row and protect what is ours, especially as women. I see too many times women coming to me who are not getting what they deserve at the dissolution of a marriage, and then unfortunately have to depend on credit or family members. And really, this is not a position that we want to be in if we can alleviate some of that stress. So, backing up
Agreed.
to pre purchasing, if I want to put a prenup in place, how do I know if I should? Like, who is a good candidate to do this?
I would say everyone. It's not just for the wealthy. Anybody should consider having a prenuptial agreement. Um, your first step would be to look at the law in your jurisdiction and say, if I were to separate, do I like these laws? Does this work for our relationship? And have a discussion about that. If it doesn't feel quite right, then you can opt out of those laws. And that's something that you would want to get done, close to the time you start reaching either that common law or before marriage. Um, so definitely it isn't for the wealthy. It's not a prediction of your future relationship and the success of your relationship. I think there's sort of this feeling that we don't talk about them and it's kind of hush hush, and that's changing slowly. But it's still something that I think a lot of people are nervous about, nervous to bring up with their partner. In my experience, I think that it's romantic to have the discussion, because if you can be vulnerable to have that discussion and explain your fears and what you're worried about if we were to separate and how we would both be okay or not okay, and you can have that discussion with your partner, I think that says a lot about the relationship. So I certainly think it's a good discussion to have and will give you a good insight into what the future would look like.
Yeah, that's such a good point. I always say the most worthwhile things involve kind of the unsexy work, like talking
Hmm.
about money. And I'm talking about money all
Yes.
day, every day, especially on this
Yeah.
podcast. And I know that many women, especially, can feel self conscious when speaking about money to their partners because, quite frankly, we've not been socialized to be confident in financial conversations. So, if you could provide kind of a starting point for my listeners, what kind of questions or what kind of topics should we be bringing up to our partners in anticipation of setting up a prenuptial agreement?
So I think the first step would be to have a good handle on your own finances and
Oh,
know what's
that's such
going
a
on
good
with your
point.
with
Yes.
your own, because I see a lot of women too that don't know, and their partner handles their own finances for them and handles everything for the family. And so have a really good idea of what you have in your name, what you owe, what the bills are, how to pay the bills, all of that stuff first to know how are you on your own. And then from there, have a discussion about what your partner has as well. One thing people don't realize is that if you were to separate, and your partner has debt, even if you didn't know about it, you're still responsible for that debt.
Ooh.
unless you can show, yeah, unless you can show the person dissipated assets, so like blue assets on things and blue money, and that can be a hard argument, and that can be an argument that requires, going to court and getting a court order, which is not something you want to do. So having a discussion about spending, working on budgets together, know what each other has, knowing what you have. So looking up your credit score, that kind of thing, what's opened in your name. Um, just being cognizant of, the debt you're accumulating in the relationship versus the debt your partner is. Are you always putting, trips and things like that on your credit card and not theirs? Because at the end of the day, although it's shareable, you're the one that's going to have to service that debt post separation. You're the one that's going to have to make that minimum payment while you're figuring things out. So having a good handle of your finances, and being able to ask the question of the other person about theirs as well, I think would be step one to having that discussion.
And just great financial habits, to have money meetings, to know
Hmm.
where you are yourself. And
Hmm.
if you're someone who's listening and you're thinking, oh, I don't really know where I am financially, you are not alone. I'd say you are
Hmm.
probably like the majority of Canadians who are burying their head in the sand in 2025 because times are tough and it sucks a little. So don't feel discouraged if you're the person who doesn't really know where you're standing. But I have many resources. Get a hold of me if you want some help with that. Yeah, great advice, Kim. So now I'm kind of thinking about the life stages specifically of women. So we purchase the home, get married, we have this prenuptial agreement in place, and then wha-bam, we have kids,
Yeah.
and our earning years look very different from those of our spouses or our partners. How do we ensure that if we do leave the relationship, we are going to be supported, or we're not going to have zero because we're not making income? Say we've taken time off to watch the kids. What happens in that scenario, and can my prenuptial agreement grow with me?
It can. I think that's something that you would want to keep in mind when you sign a prenuptial agreement. Are we going to potentially have children, and one of us be out of the workforce for a while? And so when you do that prenuptial agreement, what you could do is say, look, it's void if we have children, or it's only, it's in place for 10 years or 5 years or that sort of thing. And then we revisit it. So you definitely want to keep in mind if you are going to have children or be out of the workforce, what that might look like. Spousal support is one of the areas where, if the prenuptial agreement is really, really unfair to one party, there is instances where the court has intervened and said that is unreasonable. So that is one of the areas that maybe not as secure. So you want to be reasonable and negotiate in good faith from the beginning. But you certainly can have clauses in your agreement that says, if we were to, have a child together, we revisit this, because you don't know what's going to happen. You don't know if you're going to be off work. You don't know if you're going to be the parent staying at home. You don't know how it's going to impact your career. And so you want to know you could be okay financially if you were to separate. And so without a prenuptial agreement, spousal support is a discussion that you would have. With it, you can still have that discussion. So you don't have to opt out of the law. Some people just do prenuptial agreements just for property. So they just want to keep their businesses separate, or, the savings that they have or things like that. But you want to keep that in mind, because if you're going to be the parent that, has a different income, you want the ability to argue for spousal support and seek it if you need it. You don't want your kids to have, different lifestyles in each home. You want to equalize that. So you definitely want to keep that in mind when you do that initial prenuptial agreement.
And then further down the road, when we're looking at retirement, if I'm collecting a pension from my employer, is that something that I can protect in a prenuptial agreement so that only I have access to that, should the marriage dissolve?
Yes, you can. So you can opt out of sharing pensions. And so again, that would be done when you do that initial cohabitation agreement, prenuptial agreement. You can also do a post-nuptial agreement. So once you're married, you do an agreement that says what's going to happen if you were to separate. Now, if one
That was
party
my
doesn't
next
want to
question.
sign it,
Incredible.
yeah,
You're
yeah.
amazing. Tell me more.
If one party doesn't want to sign it, the laws in place at the time, if you were to separate, are the laws. So you could say to your partner, let's sign a prenuptial agreement that says, I don't have to pay you spousal support. And if they say no, and you two separate, then you don't have a postnuptial agreement. So therefore, you have to potentially pay spousal support. So it is something that's always better to be done before those rights and responsibilities are triggered. So before you're married in Manitoba, before you're living together for 3 years, have those discussions and have that agreement done. Because once those laws are already in place and you've met the timeline, then the default is the law. But a postnuptial
Mhm.
agreement is something that can be helpful, as you navigate life and realize one person maybe stayed home or one person sacrificed X, Y, and Z or that sort of thing. You can have a discussion about what may work for the two of you.
Now, as business owners, are there special considerations that we should be making if we are entering into this prenuptial agreement?
I think just the only consideration is if you want your business to be separate, then specifically list it in the prenuptial agreement very clearly, its own paragraph that says, this is my business, it's completely separate, everything associated with that is mine. And for your partner's benefit, paragraphs that say any debt or tax liabilities, or if you were to get, sued or things like that, those are not your partner's responsibility either. So it goes both ways. It protects the person who doesn't want to get caught up in what the business is doing, and also protects the person who has the business. So um, you might want to look at a prenuptial agreement or a postnuptial agreement just from this lens of, I don't want to be saddled with debt or problems, so I want to insulate myself from that.
Just to keep both debt and
Hmm.
earnings separate so
Yeah,
that, yeah,
yeah.
you're not liable. Yeah, that's great advice. So, in that same vein, what should couples be cognizant of when they're creating this agreement to ensure that it's balanced and fair? Are there certain questions that you would say they should be asking each other about future plans?
I would say that as you have the discussion about, what would it look like if we were to separate, and if you think I would want X, Y, or Z, imagine how your partner would feel if they said that to you. And I think that can give you a good sort of pulse on uh, if what you're requesting or thinking about is, reasonable. Um, and I think that, if you need help with that, lawyers can assist with having those discussions. And it doesn't have to be in an adversarial way, it can be a very collaborative way. So oftentimes we'll get together with both parties and their lawyer, each of their lawyers, and we sit down and talk about, okay, what is this going to look like? Especially when it's complicated with business and we're trying to figure out what exactly do each party want, and how do we achieve that? And sometimes clients can get caught up and maybe end up getting frustrated with each other because they're not really able to vocalize what they're looking for, and we can help do that. So sometimes clients come to us and say, this is what we want, write it up, and sometimes we sit with them and sort of walk through all the choices and really get an idea of what their needs are. Uh, yeah, so I would say definitely start with that.
I think that point about holding the mirror up and saying how you would feel if it was being asked of you or demanded of you, I think is
Yeah,
so pertinent. I myself, when I purchased my first home, did not bring the down payment. That was my then boyfriend, now husband, and it was brought up: is there a cohabitation agreement or a prenuptial agreement? And I was so offended. But now I'm thinking if that had been me, I would have absolutely brought that up, but I'm just a little bit more
yeah,
spicy. And if it was my daughters, I would
yeah.
absolutely insist that there was some sort of agreement put in place. So I think a little bit of maturity on my end, but yeah, definitely something that would have been helpful to me at that
To have,
time.
yeah. And I think the vibe around those agreements are changing. And especially now with a lot of people needing help from family to purchase their first home, I think and the dollar amounts are a lot higher than say they were, 20 years ago. And so it's a bigger financial hit to help your children. So having something in place to ensure that money stays in the family if something doesn't work out. And you can also, set up your agreement that says, this is in place for 5 years. So if we're together past 5 years, then we share everything. But it's a way to just sort of protect both of you for those initial years when you're trying to figure out, is this a long-term relationship or not?
Hmm.
And one thing I would say too is that every area has a different timeline for when you have rights and responsibilities with your partner. So, for example, the Income Tax Act says, which is Canada-wide, says that you are common law after a year. So you file as common law after a year. Pension legislation can be a year. And so there's different legislation that has different sort of timelines. So you'd want to check with your individual province and where you're at, but you may have to sort of juggle those different timelines when you're deciding when you want to have this conversation.
And I'm hearing that really you want to have a great team player on your side as a family law attorney. So, somebody who can help you through the process. Now, let's talk a little bit about that process. What does it look like when I'm starting to house hunt and I'm thinking, oh, yeah, we definitely need something in place? What's the first step? Tell me all of it.
Okay, so the first step would be you would reach out to a lawyer who offers those services. A lot of lawyers will have on their website, an estimate of cost, or that they offer those type of services. So you reach out. What I do is initially have a consultation and meet with clients to find out exactly what's going on, what they're looking to have in there, explain what sort of terms you can have in an agreement, things you can't contract out of, things you can. So, for example, you can't contract out of future child support. You can't say, if we have children, I'm never going to pay you child support. So there's certain things you can't contract out of. So we walk through what those are, what they're looking for. And then from there, if they want to retain me to draft the agreement, then they reach out and do that. Usually I would work with the one client and draft it, and then we would send it to the other client to review with their lawyer. But the clients can work together and review it together and make sure they're comfortable at the same time. So it's not this adversarial, I've got my agreement and I'm giving it to your lawyer now. And it's very much a collaborative process in trying to meet everyone's needs.
Yeah, I think it does make a difference to what kind of juju is surrounding the whole agreement. I mean, I was
Yeah.
asked in a dark room with two men, whether there was a
Yeah.
prenuptial agreement. I felt,
Yeah, that's
no,
awkward. Yeah.
right? It's not really a happy, fuzzy experience, but I do think
Yeah.
that this can be made something that's positive. And at the end of the day, it's something that you're not going to regret doing for sure if you've thought through what you're putting in this agreement. So let's talk about cost. Is there a range of costs associated with these agreements?
So it's going to vary greatly depending on what province you're in. In Manitoba, I think our hourly rates are considerably lower than other provinces, is what I hear. So usually, I would say the drafting, getting it done, taxes in, everything for the person who's drafting the agreement is usually around $3,000, all said and done. And then their other party would also need independent legal advice from their own lawyer, and that's usually around 1,500, I would think. But it really just depends how many hours you need with the lawyer. If have a lot of complicated businesses and structures and things like that, then that's going to be more expensive than something a little more just opting out of legislation.
So what I'm hearing is, as a first-time home buyer who has less assets and less color to their life, it might be a
Yeah.
great time to do when you're initially purchasing, and also cheaper for you because it won't be quite as complicated if there's no kids, not very much assets or debt involved, right?
Yeah, yeah, especially if that's at the initial, start of the relationship, then you've got yourself protected. And I think that at the end of the day, it is a good investment in your relationship, in your future. You certainly can, look at the legislation in your province, and if you like that and you like the way it sets things out, then that's great. That's your prenup. You don't need to do anything different. But if you don't like it, that's when you should consider changing it and entering into an agreement that you do like.
Hmm. So I have a question for you from from the perspective of working with clients who did not have a prenup, um, and all that entails. I know my advice to my clients, if I could turn back time 30 years, would be to know yourself, to know your financial position, and to value yourself, because what you do, I think people often think, I'm not coming with very much to this relationship. I don't need to be protected, but life is long. And I think that it's important to acknowledge your potential as well as an earner, and acknowledge what you're kind of the weight that you're bearing in the family system. So that would be my advice to folks
Yeah.
who are looking to transact. But what would your advice be to someone who is just at the beginning stages?
I would echo exactly what you said. And it's not about who has more money. At the end of the day, if you were to separate, you're dividing debts as well. So the person who has a high income might be racking up a ton of debt that you don't know about, that you're then responsible for. So it's not just, oh, I don't earn as much, so I don't need this agreement. I think everybody should consider it, regardless of the rule in the relationship. So I would definitely echo what you're saying. Know yourself, know your finances, know what you want things to look like at the end of the day. and certainly, have a discussion with your partner about, if we were to separate, what do we want that to look like, and how would we feel moving forward?
I like what you're saying about debt too, because at a time where things are exciting, when we're getting married, when we're purchasing homes, we don't think about debt. But debt and credit is one of those things that, especially on my end, people purchasing homes, that's the one thing that we can't change quickly. We can find money, we can earn more money. That's great. We can get a new job. But credit, that takes a while and that is a process to rebuild. So be cognizant of who you're entering into these relationships and transactions with, because their debt does become your debt. And to me, that is scary. Taking on a whole load of debt is scarier than losing money, because it's putting you doubly in a horrible position. So thank you
I agree
for mentioning
completely.
that,
Yeah.
because yeah, it's kind of a ladder you need to climb out of a deep dark hole when you have debt. Whereas
Yeah.
putting the money up front, $3,000 up front is nothing when you're thinking of what you could be losing in time.
Yep. And to give you that peace of mind,
Hmm.
um, you know, uh, we buy car insurance because we want to protect ourselves. We don't think we're going to get in a car accident. Buy house insurance. We don't think our house is going to burn down, but we do that just in case. So I look at this agreement as a form of insurance. And so you know what you're getting, you know what you're getting into. You can plan, you can keep that in mind as you're in the relationship and you're making decisions. You make decisions knowing what that agreement says. And so I think it's definitely a good form of insurance, and people should really seriously think about it, because there's a lot of things at the end of the day that um, you might be surprised to find out are problems if you were to separate, that you weren't aware were problems in debt that you didn't know existed.
Yeah, Kim, that's another great point, because when we're making decisions from a place of financial insecurity, which you may be if you are not the income earner in your household, if you're staying at home with the kids and you don't know what could happen if you're in a bad position and if you have to leave, then you don't really
Mhm.
have choices. And as women, we want to have as many choices as possible so that we can navigate this world that truly was not built for us in a way that's
Mhm.
empowering and will acknowledge all of our gifts and everything that we have to offer, so that we can then go do what we need to do and not be afraid of staying in this relationship because of money. So I want to
Yeah.
commend you and thank you for adding that color to our conversation. I think it's just so important. Um,
And I think oh, sorry for interrupting.
no, go
I
ahead.
think
I'm
another
just
thing I would
rambling.
say is just, I see a lot of women that don't have their own bank account, don't have their own credit card, that sort of thing. And so I would say you should always have that. It doesn't necessarily mean you have a ton of money in it or a huge limit, but have those things, build up your own credit, have access to it. So if you do need to leave the relationship, you've got something you can rely on there. You have some history with the bank. You have some money in an account, something. And so I think that would be something that I would advise too, because I see a lot of women who don't have any of that.
And if that is you, please book my calendar. The link is in my show notes. I will give you the best first step to get to where you need to be able to transact financially and to live a financially free life, free of your partner. Not that we don't love them, we love them greatly, but we also want to be independent of our own rights. So, Kim, tell me, where can we find you? How can people connect with you? And if they want to tell you that something resonated in this episode, how can they reach you?
So the best way to reach me would be the website soulfamilylaw.ca, and from there you can get my Instagram, my Facebook handle, and see what's going on there.
And we will link that all in the show notes as well. Thank you so much for joining me today,
Thank you
Kim.
for having me. It was wonderful talking with you.
Absolutely.